The war in Iran has shaken the Middle East, and for Saudi Arabia, the impacts have been particularly profound and interesting. Understanding how the conflict has reshaped its international ties is what we're looking at here. Riyadh is trying to manage its relationship with Washington while grappling with the threat from its regional neighbour Iran and keeping its economic transformation on track too.
But it's become increasingly clear that Saudi Arabia is in support of the operations that have taken place targeting Iran because they fundamentally weaken what is a strategic adversary to Saudi Arabia, and therefore is something that Saudi would support and has continued to engage in its own particular way.
That's Megan Sutcliffe, Principal Analyst for the Middle East and Africa at Sibylline, a strategic risk advisory firm. She makes it clear that Saudi Arabia is under a lot of pressure right now to avoid what she calls an economic nightmare.
So, the way that Saudi Arabia is likely seeing the region at the moment is that the status quo is not tolerable. Firstly, the Strait of Hormuz is of course closed. That has been extremely disruptive to Saudi exports of oil and other commodities, as well as Saudi imports of other commodities. Although the Red Sea remains open, of course, Saudi Arabia is acutely aware that the Iranian-backed Houthis remain in Yemen. And it was only 2 days ago that the Houthis issued another statement following the re-engagement between Iran and Israel that they would install a, quote, blockade on Israeli maritime activity, which is essentially the Houthis' way of warning that they will potentially re-engage in attacks targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea. If that were to occur and the Houthis were to re-engage in hostilities, then that would be essentially an economic nightmare for Saudi Arabia. That would cut it off from its two major trade arteries and would isolate it on the global stage.
So what to do? If Saudi Arabia needs to act to mitigate that, well, where might it start? Megan Sutcliffe says its defence sector could be the one area where major shifts occur first. In other words, a big spending boom.
Saudi Arabia is aware of its vulnerabilities in the region. However, I think what we have seen during this conflict is Iran demonstrating that this vulnerability is present in areas where possibly Saudi Arabia had not thought that they would be, or that those threats are more acute than previously considered. What this is likely to do when it comes to Saudi Arabia is that in the next few years, we will see a diversification of its air defense systems, a diversification of where and what it is buying from defense contractors, and likely some form of domestic development when it comes to drone development and drone interception system development. This is going to be a spending boom in Saudi Arabia, and so it's likely we're going to see that industry advancing very, very quickly.
And while economic diversification has long been a priority for Saudi rulers, the war with Iran is prompting them to lean into that even further through broadening their partnerships.
While, of course, the partnership with the US is the sort of center, the core of Saudi defense pacts, at the same time, it is worth noting that, for example, just in the past 6 months, we saw Saudi Arabia deepening its security ties with Pakistan. That's a relationship that has existed for a very long time, but has really gone from strength to strength, particularly in the face of increasing Iranian hostilities. So, yes, I think it is fair to say that Saudi Arabia will lean more into diversification, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that will be at the expense of relations with the United States. Rather, it will be part of a broadening of Saudi Arabia's defense base and a broadening of its partnerships worldwide.
But there's competition. As you might expect, the Saudis are not the only ones in the region trying to attract those big international investments.
In the economic sphere, we're likely going to see an intensification of the competition between Saudi Arabia to attract foreign investment as part of their broader diversification goals. In Saudi Arabia, this is Vision 2030, for example. In the UAE, this is a long-running plan to move away from an exclusive dependence on oil in order to improve economic stability and insulation from fluctuation on global markets. That type of competition, of course, can be beneficial for businesses because it means that both states are actively trying to attract investment in areas like critical minerals, in areas like data center investment and development, AI, technology, major hospitality and sporting events like the F1 or the World Cup, for example. But also what that does is that it can create a race to the bottom. And of course, the implications that that can have for individuals within those states, particularly foreign nationals who are potentially working in substandard labour conditions, can also be particularly acute.
As well as that fierce competition with the UAE, you heard Megan mention Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 there. That's the kingdom's huge reform program to increase its importance for tourism, trade and logistics while becoming less dependent on oil. So to what extent has the war in Iran set those plans back?
It is worth noting that part of Saudi's economic diversification drive has been this effort to develop its port infrastructure to turn it into a global hub for shipping, in the way that, for example, Jebel Ali has been for the UAE. That has been successful on the Red Sea, so essentially on Saudi Arabia's western coast. And at the moment, the Red Sea port facilities are seeing far more activity as states essentially continue to try to get their goods out of their national territory and to global buyers. So we've seen more activity there. But on its eastern coast, activity has dropped because of the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz and because of explicit Iranian targeting of those facilities during the conflict. And so that has provided Saudi Arabia essentially with a mixed bag when it comes to the fallout from this conflict. Generally speaking, it is also worth noting that investments for mega projects like NEOM, for example, have somewhat dried up and led to a scaling back of those projects. That's not something that is a direct result of the conflict. Rather, it speaks to a decreasing confidence in Saudi Arabia's capacity to make good on the development of these mega projects, these huge futuristic cities, for example, or major facilities. So generally speaking, to summarize, we have seen disruption, but Saudi Arabia has certainly not been dealt the worst hand of cards when it comes to the region. Unfortunately, that role is primarily linked to the UAE, but also to a certain extent to Qatar as well.
Despite all the efforts at diversification, Megan views the US as an indispensable partner for the Saudis, and that's not likely to change anytime soon.
Yes, I would characterize the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States as still being very strong, based on, of course, the mutual understanding of security threats in the region, based on the history of cooperation and collaboration, but also simply based on defense sales. The majority of arms in Saudi Arabia are either reliant on or stem from US manufacturers, and the very basis of that relationship is going to keep those relations tight, particularly over the next few years.
So, given all that, why is it sometimes so hard to understand the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia? Megan says part of it is down to one of those two being very loud, the other very quiet.
What can be quite challenging about interpreting the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, as well as, of course, the dynamic with Iran, is that while the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is very vocal and makes many statements, often several statements per day, regarding developments in the region, Saudi Arabia can be much more quiet. Often, the way that we see Saudi Arabia expressing its foreign policy interests or its goals for the region is either through very discreet or vaguely worded statements, and rather a movement in terms of actions. So investments in various portfolios, meetings between high-level officials. And it can be quite challenging to interpret that relatively disparate dynamic, a very loud partner on one hand and a very quiet partner on another.
One of the big questions now too has to do with Israel. Donald Trump has asked a number of countries, including Saudi Arabia, to sign on to the Abraham Accords, normalising ties with the Jewish state. So far, they've declined to do so. Megan says the war in Gaza has sapped public appetite in Saudi Arabia for normalising relations with Israel after momentum had been building in recent years. So are those efforts now completely dead?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the deal is completely dead because, of course, things can change very, very quickly in international relations and particularly in the Middle East. If you had asked the Emiratis in, say, 2010 whether they would be normalizing relations with Israel in 10 years, they probably would have said no. So things can change, and so I wouldn't entirely rule out a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel in the coming 5 to 10 years, for example. However, in the immediate term, there are major roadblocks to this potential normalization going forth. Saudi Arabia has made it very clear that one of its conditions for engaging in negotiations to normalize relations with Israel will be the development of at least a roadmap towards the establishment of a Palestinian state, a realization of the two-state solution.
Where does all this leave the region? Getting anyone to predict what happens next in the Middle East with any certainty is a big ask, but we did ask Megan Sutcliffe. Here's her outlook for the rest of 2026, focused on Saudi Arabia.
It does feel like the situation is just changing on a daily basis. But in terms of what we can expect to see from Saudi Arabia, I would expect to see relations with the United States being kept particularly close. I would also expect to see Saudi Arabia attempting to consolidate its control of OPEC, its leadership of OPEC, and warm its relations with constituent members. I'd also expect to see Saudi Arabia continue to diversify its sources of investment when it comes to these economic diversification efforts. And I'd also expect to see Saudi attempting to maximize the benefits that it can gain from its security partnerships with countries like Pakistan. I'd expect to see Saudi relations with Iran continue to deteriorate throughout the year. Of course, there was the very notable renormalization of relations in early 2023 between Saudi and Iran that some saw as an opportunity for a breakthrough in the region. But even before the current conflict began earlier this year, that relationship was hitting a lot of road bumps. Essentially, Iran was unhappy with the amount of investment it had received from Saudi Arabia, while Saudi Arabia was unhappy with what it saw as Iran's failure to distance itself from its proxy network, that, of course, undermines the stability of the operating environment in the region, and of course, for the Saudis, is a particular concern with reference to the Houthis. So I'd expect to see that relationship continue to worsen, and that will put it in alignment with the United States when it comes to relations with Iran. It will also indirectly put it into alignment with Israel on certain matters, but at the same time, I would not expect to see the normalization of relations. With reference to Syria, I'd also expect to see further Saudi investment there, and a particular warming of relations between the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the President of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. That potentially could trigger increasing competition between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which of course exercises a lot of influence in Syria at the moment. But equally, given the opportunities for reconstruction and development in Syria, it is possible that there are sufficient opportunities to go around to the extent that that will not trigger an overtly conflictual dynamic between Turkey and Saudi, at least in the coming year.
So, a long list of predictions there. What do you think of them? Can Saudi Arabia turn this moment of upheaval to its advantage? Let us know in the comments. We've also got a lot more on the war in Iran on our channel. That's all for now. I'm Jared Reed in Berlin. Thank you to Megan Sutcliffe and my producers Till Boller, Aaron Tilton, Isabella Nabodny and Yvonne Cheshire. Take care.